keeps going.
Other than I2 crisis.
Yeah, he already set up one defense this morning, so he's on it.
Oh, really?
Like the schedule.
Oh, nice. So as everyone's getting settled with the refreshments, I'll go ahead and introduce Sophia. It's my pleasure to introduce Sophia and welcome you all to a pseudo-defense. So this is the best kind of master's defense because there's not really a committee and there's not really a pass or fail. So it's a celebration of all of Sophia's accomplishments over this past year and a sort of seminar. So she'll be speaking for about 20 or 30 minutes and then we can open it up to discussion at the end. Over the past year, I've had the great pleasure of working with Sophia. We've joined forces and have appreciated her commitment and dedication and good ideas, and also her presence in the lab. She's been a catalyst for creating a sense of community over the course of the past year, and has certainly had many academic achievements. So in addition to taking a leadership role with her thesis, of course, she's been invited to join 2 other peer-reviewed articles and has been making great strides in the academic world. She has also been involved in teaching, giving guest lectures, and contributed in the classroom in meaningful ways. And she's been involved in service. So over the past year, she's done a lot to raise visibility of women in science, for instance, and increase visibility of minorities through recruiting students that were involved in a project facilitated by the Parks and Environmental Behavior Research Group over the past semester. So she's worked with our group and also Bill Stewart's group in the Department of Export and Tourism. So yeah, we've really appreciated our time together and are looking forward to the presentation that she'll be giving on her thesis research. So I'll go ahead and I'll pass over to Sophia.
Thank you. So just to preface, due to the technological issues, I have to stand behind this podium. So unfortunately, I can't engage with you all as much as I would like to, but that's the deal. So today I'm presenting my thesis research. It's titled Expanding the Environmental Value Scale, Understanding How Hedonia and Eudaimonia Influence Pro-Environmental Behavior. Just a bit of background and an outline. I'll give you a bit of an introduction about myself and kind of my research interests, then a bit of a brief literature review on values in pro-environmental behavior, an outline of Denali, the location where my research was conducted, then followed by our research results, management implications, and conclusions. As most of you or all of you know in this room, I'm a visiting scholar here at the University of Illinois. I'm doing a Master's of International Nature Conservation, so that's kind of the backdrop for my research. And I am a student at the University of Göttingen in Germany, which is in central Germany, you can see there. Our second semester was in New Zealand, down at the bottom, and my cohort is 8 other students who are currently in 8 different countries as well, doing their own thesis research. After that, I had the pleasure of working at the World Wildlife Fund as a conservation psychology intern in Washington, D.C., which was a great foundation for my thesis research here. And finally, I have the pleasure of joining you all for my 4th and very extended semester doing my thesis research on values and pro-environmental behavior. So my research focuses on the ecological and biophysical aspects of nature. This was largely the focus of my bachelor's research, and then towards the end of my bachelor's, I realized that humans are an integral part to both the solution and the problem for conservation issues. And thus I shifted my focus to looking at the overlap between these 2 sections, so the social and the natural sciences. My research goals overall are to increase and improve conservation success and policy, and thus that's kind of the backdrop of this presentation. Luckily, over the last 40 years or so, there's been increasing concern about the environmental issues that we're facing and also increasing support for mitigating these issues. However, unfortunately, the issues continue to persist as well, despite the extensive policy and management initiatives that have been implemented. Part of that issue is that education has been the primary tactic for the conservation environmental issue, and extensive research, especially in the behavioral sciences and psychology, demonstrates that education alone is not enough to change human behavior. So my research broadly seeks to address how can conservationists change human behaviors to reduce environmental impacts if education alone is not the answer. This is a quote that was published last year in Science, and I think it really provides a good backdrop for my research, which is humans don't protect what they don't know and value. So without further ado, I'll be talking about pro-environmental behaviors, but also human value structures in the context of the environment. So first, I'd like to define values for you all, so we're on the same page. Values are enduring core belief systems that transcend specific situations, influencing our goals, informing individuals' relationships with the physical world. In addition to that, behaviors are defined as intent-oriented actions performed as a function of internal processes and environmental stimuli. So the relationship between values and behaviors is that values are these core foundational principles that influence all of our behaviors. So there are very few values, as you can see. Oops, is my finger? Yeah, here, there are very few values, and these inform all of our behaviors. Though they're separated by several degrees, they influence our beliefs and our attitudes and norms, and subsequently the numerous behaviors we engage in on a daily basis. In addition to that, we'll be focusing specifically on environmental values, and these are guiding principles that influence our goals, decisions, and behaviors that shape our concern for nature and how we engage with nature as well. And there are several ways to look at human values. This is one framework known as Schwartz's Wheel of Universal Human Values. This was very seminal and foundational to the study of human values, and he provides two main foundations for looking, or two dimensions for looking at human values. The first are self-enhancing values, which are primarily focused on an individual's own well-being and needs, such as here we have achievement, so your success and your ambitions, and as well as hedonism, which is enjoying life and pleasure. And then the second dimension that's outlined in the literature is referred to as self-transcending values, which take into consideration not only your own needs, but the well-being of humanity and the environment, which can be of equal or of more consideration than your self-consideration. And these types of values include universalism, such as equality or protecting the environment, and then benevolence, such as having mature love or true friendships and meaning in life. So for this research, we decided to use a different framework. Stern published his values framework in the late 1990s, early 2000s, and he outlines three primary values that are important for environmental behaviors. The first he refers to as altruistic values, which encompass a world at peace, equality, and social justice. The second dimension is referred to as biospheric values, which are focused on unity with nature, protecting the environment, and a world of beauty. And the third that he outlines is referred to as egoistic values, which are focused on authority, social power, and influence. However, over the last several decades, there's been advancements in the literature, and more recently in 2014, a new value dimension was proposed by Steg et al., which she refers to as hedonic values. And these are focused on seeking pleasure, fun, reducing worries, and enjoying life. And while this was in Schwartz's value wheel, this wasn't previously associated with environmental values. Thus, it's an addition. And then finally, the focus of this paper is expanding eudaimonic values, which are focused on personal development, excellence, and personal best. These values were proposed as environmental values in 2017. However, up to date, there have been no empirical studies testing eudaimonic values in relation to the environment. So the contributions of this research are these two value dimensions in the context of the environment, and also these two value dimensions propose a variable of time when understanding environmental values and pro-environmental behavior. So hedonic is focused on your short-term needs, fulfilling your satisfaction here and now, whereas eudaimonic values is looking at those long-term implications. If I do something right now, perhaps I don't like it as much, but it will have long-term payoffs. So these two value dimensions weigh that time difference. These value dimensions also funnel into the two dimensions I had mentioned, self-transcending, where biospheric and altruistic are part of, and then additionally self-enhancing, which include egoistic, hedonic, and eudaimonic values. So a previous critique of Stern's value scale is that there was only one self-enhancing value dimension present, and that there were potentially pro-environmental behaviors that were not egoistically motivated, but were definitely self-enhancing. Thus, adding these two dimensions could potentially help us understand how people engage in self-enhancing behaviors that are not egoistically motivated. In addition to understanding values, pro-environmental behavior is an important term, so I'd like to define it. Behavior that consciously seeks to minimize the negative impacts of one's actions on the natural and built world. And behavior is also multidimensional. So individuals can engage in behavior in a variety of contexts, but there are two primary ones. The first is private sphere behavior. So these are behaviors you can engage in alone or perhaps with close family and friends. When you engage in private sphere behaviors, it's things like reducing your water use or recycling. And then there are also public sphere behaviors. These are things where you engage in potentially with your colleagues at work or when you're at a national park recreating. These are things that have more eyes on you, let's say. Potentially when you write a letter to your senator or run for office, also share with people that are beyond your immediate social networks, your concerns about the environment or other things. So now that we have that bit of backdrop on literature, I'd like to present my three objectives. The first was to develop and test the measurement properties of this 5-dimensional environmental value scale, and namely including hedonia and eudaimonia. The second is to identify the value profiles of survey respondents in the context of Denali National Park and Preserve. And the third is to examine the relationship between individuals' value orientations, socio-demographics, and intended pro-environmental behaviors. As I mentioned, the research was conducted in Denali National Park and Preserve. This is a 6 million acre national park and preserve. It houses the majority of the Alaskan range, including Denali, which is the highest peak in North America at 20,000 feet or roughly 6,000 meters. The park is located between Fairbanks and Anchorage in a subarctic landscape and has glacial moraines, both current glaciers and reminiscent features of glaciers, and as well as kettle ponds. The park and preserve houses a variety of megafauna, including Dall sheep, wolves, grizzly bear, caribou, moose, and lynx, as well as a variety of flora, including the primary tree species of white spruce, aspen, willow, tussock grasses, and goldenrod. The park is managed jointly by the Department of Interior's National Park Service, as well as the Bureau of Land Management, which is a bit different than other national parks in the US. In 2016, the year our research was conducted, the park had close to 600,000 visits, though to date it's over 650,000 annually. And the primary activities individuals engage in include hiking, bus tours, camping, photography, wildlife viewing, staying at lodges, and listening to natural noises or sounds. So our data was collected on site between May and August 2016 in Denali National Park and Preserve by 2 trained field assistants. Our sample size was 667 respondents, and we had a response rate of 90.6%. The data collection was stratified across 28 weekdays and 14 weekend days, as well as time of day to ensure that we had randomization of our response. As per each day, a rule was set, so perhaps they'd sample every 3rd person, but this rule was set at the beginning of the day to ensure that it was randomized. And the survey was a 2-part survey questionnaire. So the first part included asking individuals about their values, their behaviors, their beliefs, their trip characteristics, etc. And that's the focus of this research. But there was also a second portion that asked individuals to allocate points to different aspects of the park that they enjoyed to understand their assigned values. So what aspects of the park they preferred, but that's beyond the scope of this research. So in our survey, we asked about 5 value dimensions. The first, as I mentioned, was egoistic, and these values were rated on a Likert scale of 1 to 9, with 1 being opposed to my values and 9 being of supreme importance. An example of an egoistic question is something like social power, control over others, or dominance. The second dimension is altruistic, such as a world at peace, free of war and conflict. The third dimension is biospheric values, which includes protecting the environment or preserving nature. The fourth dimension, which we drew from Steg et al. In 2014, is pleasure, gratification from desires or enjoying life, food, sex, and leisure. And the fifth dimension is eudaimonic values. For this, we created 4 items. As it has not been empirically tested, we drew from the well-being sciences that have studied the differentiation between hedonia and eudaimonia and developed items based on their literature reviews. We had 4 items here to make sure that they all tested well at the end, and ultimately we ended up dropping one, the gratification for oneself, fulfilling a personal desire due to cross-loading, likely because gratification was used both in the hedonic questions and the eudaimonic questions, which might have created confusion. So we ended up with these 3 questions per dimension. We also measured 4 dimensions of pro-environmental behavior. The first is referred to as conservation lifestyle, which are things, mostly private sphere behaviors such as recycling, reducing your energy consumption or water use, buying environmentally friendly or energy efficient products, and these questions were rated on a 1 to 5 Likert scale, with 1 being never and 5 being almost always. We also asked about land stewardship, so these are things such as avoiding feeding the wildlife or hiking in areas that are more durable to reduce your environmental impact. The third dimension is called social environmentalism, so this is talking to other people about environmental issues or participating in as an active member of discussion. And then finally, environmental citizenship. So this is participating in citizen science research or donating money to an environmental cause. Ultimately, we also dropped one of these dimensions. There were low factor loading scores for the land stewardship. So this was the section that asked about avoiding feeding the wildlife and hiking in less impacted areas. So for the analyses, we used 3 dimensions of pro-environmental behavior. For the analysis of the value dimensions, we conducted both reliability and validity tests for Cronbach's alpha, composite reliability, and average variance explained. We were looking for thresholds, which we identified in previous literature, to make sure that these dimensions held. We found that all the dimensions performed quite well, specifically looking at hedonia and eudaimonia, because that was our primary focus. And they all met thresholds, both across the Cronbach's alpha, composite reliability, and average variance explained, except for the dimension of egoistic values, which fell short in all 3 categories. But this has been tested across the world, country, and this wasn't a primary focus of our research, and it almost met the threshold, so it's not a very big concern test. Oh, and then finally, we tested all our, sorry, I had a couple points here. We conducted then ANOVA and chi-square tests to compare socio-demographics and trip characteristics for the pooled data, and then all stats were estimated in SPSS and M+. So our pooled data was then segmented using a latent profile analysis. Latent profile analysis uses 4 indicators to assess model fit. The first is AIC, BIC, entropy, and bootstrap likelihood ratio chi-square tests. As you can see in this figure, our model estimated 5 classes. So this means it segmented the data by latent variables into 5 classes. And what we're looking for is that AIC numbers and BIC numbers to go down. So the smaller it is, the better fit it is. And then also entropy should meet a threshold of 0.8 or greater. However, as you can see here, we actually found the bootstrap likelihood ratio increased substantially from the 4th to 5th class. So it went from 0.03 to 0.266. And so for us, this indicates that the 5-class model, though the other indicators fit, this was not the best model fit, and we ended up choosing a 4-class model. So our data was ultimately segmented into 4 value profile classes. Results. So our population hailed from 26 countries across the world, across 5 continents as well. However, the majority of our respondents were US residents at 85%. Our population was predominantly white at 88%, and we had equal gender distribution roughly. We found that the average age was 44 years, but upon further inspection, noticed that the mode was 28 and found that our data was actually bimodally distributed. So you can see here that we have one mode, or one hump, we'll call it, at late 20s, early 30s, and then another one at late 50s to mid 60s. And this has been found in previous socio-demographic research in Denali National Park and Preserve due to the segmentation of tourists. There's people that come for the wilderness attributes, and then there are also people that come on cruise ships to see wilderness, but don't necessarily engage in that backcountry hiking and stuff. So this is not concerning and previously supported as well. We found our population was well educated, with about 32% having a bachelor's degree and 40% having a master's or graduate degree. And they were from middle to upper middle class, with 50,000 as an annual income for 33% and over 100,000 for 34% of our population. Trip characteristics, our visitors were first-time visitors, mostly at 80%. They spent an average of 2.3 or 3.24 nights in the park, and our average group size was roughly 3 people. It seemed that people predominantly traveled with their family at 54%, and then 26% with friends. The remaining percents were mixtures of friends and family, or alone. The most common activities, as I mentioned, engaged in at Denali National Park included 73% photography, 69% wildlife viewing, 65% hiking, 63% the bus tours. For context, Denali has a roughly 90-mile road that goes in, and that's the only way you can enter the park. So people are, that's the only way you can get in, and everybody will take a bus, but some people use that as their primary park viewing, where other people get out and do hiking activities or like air helicopter plane. 43% of people engaged in listening to natural sounds, 42% camping, and then 27% staying at lodges. Through our latent class analysis, we had 4 value profile classes that were created. The first we refer to as the big-hearted. This group had very high pro-social values, so self-transcending values, with an average score between 8 and almost close to 9 in altruistic and biospheric. The average age was 45 with a mode of 29. This group had the highest income and they were the most educated, and there were slightly more women, though not statistically significant. We also found the second class we refer to as living the life of eudaimonia. This group had the highest relative eudaimonic and egoistic scores. The egoistic scores were fairly low across all classes, so the relative score just indicates that it was higher and there was lower variation between the other value dimensions. The average age was 45 with a mode of 32, and there were equal men and women in this group. The undecided, we refer to these individuals as such because they had very low variation in their evaluation of all value dimensions, and there was very low variation. They were right down the center. So the average scores were between 4.5 and 5.5, which is a 1-point distribution, whereas other groups had up to a 4-point distribution where they rated egoistic very low. The average age of this group was 45 with a mode of 32, and there were roughly equal men and women as well. The final group contrasts the undecided. They're referred to as the enthusiasts because they had very high valuation of all value orientations. So the scores were between 8 and 9, barring egoistic values, which was still at a 5.5, which was the highest of any class. This was the youngest group with an average age of 41 and a mode of 28. These individuals had the highest intention of engaging in pro-environmental behavior, and there were slightly more women as well. So now to expand on the value-behavior relationship, looking at kind of how the different classes performed in comparison to each other, we can see here that overall there were strong self-transcending values. You can see that the altruistic and biospheric, the range was from 0.7 to 0.9 on this log transformed figure, which indicates that overall all our respondents had fairly high pro-environmental values. We also see here that egoistic values were really low, as I had mentioned, across all the classes, so this was definitely the least favorite of the group, but pretty consistent. And then finally we see, we see here that eudaimonic and hedonic values had quite some variation, which is good for us because it shows that these are relevant for measuring during environmental value assessment. We also see here that there's high engagement in conservation lifestyle behaviors. So these are things such as recycling or buying environmentally friendly products or conserving your water. But overall, we see really low engagement elsewhere in the 2 other environmental behavioral dimensions. Even groups that had really high pro-environmental values engaged in these dimensions less. Ultimately, the group that expressed the highest intention to engage in pro-environmental behavior is the dark green line, the enthusiasts, which is not a surprise because they rated all their value dimensions quite high as well. But nonetheless, they still had significantly less intention of engaging in social environmentalism and environmental citizenship behaviors. So, discussion. Our findings demonstrate that the integration of hedonia and eudaimonia is very relevant for the environmental values literature. Our findings advance the integration of these 2 value scales and can help expand on how self-enhancing values influence individuals' engagement in pro-environmental behavior. In particular, it introduces this variable of time, which can help us understand how people weigh whether they want their need or gratification right now or whether they'd rather see long-term payoff. Previous research has elaborated that hedonic values hedonic goals seem to supersede other goal types, and thus it's postulated that with hedonic values it's similar. So part of our job may be potentially overriding or finding ways to work with these hedonic values. We also see that not all value dimensions are equal, particularly with the self-enhancing values. Egoistic, hedonic, and eudaimonic all performed quite differently, which shows that they have different explanatory power potentially for understanding pro-environmental behaviors. As far as pro-environmental behaviors go, we saw that engagement varied quite significantly. Everybody was very high in the conservation lifestyle behaviors, but there was definitely more variation among social environmentalism and environmental citizenship behaviors. One of our most interesting findings, I would say, is that eudaimonic values seem to perform as a positive relationship with pro-environmental behavior, and self-enhancing values tend to have a negative correlation with with pro-environmental behavior, because individuals that are more concerned about themselves tend to be less concerned about the environment. So this is something that definitely merits further investigation and could potentially provide insight on how to engage people in these long-term pro-environmental behaviors. And finally, we're finding that individuals are engaging more readily in private sphere behaviors, such as conservation lifestyles. So people are really eager and willing to engage in conserving your water, recycling, or buy environmentally friendly products. However, these behaviors tend to have lower impact than engaging with your social networks and running for office or writing your senator or donating money to environmental causes. So there's a clear division there on what kind of effort people are willing to engage in and what they aren't, regardless of their environmental values. So our question here is, how do we increase engagement in pro-environmental behavior? The management implications for Denali National Park and Preserve are that even though, as presumed, their visitors have really high value profiles but are less willing to engage in pro-environmental behavior than we had originally anticipated, our research allows us to identify leverage points through exploring park users' value profiles, and understanding their value profiles will help us develop targeted interventions to speak to their value profiles, but also facilitate and foster them in engaging in more pro-environmental behaviors. This is an image here of a wall that's actually already at Denali. It says, unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. This language has some eudaimonic undertones, though they didn't know this at the time of the building of the wall. Perhaps they could further efforts like this. One example we see throughout the value profiles is that eudaimonic values and hedonic values performed quite well. So developing interventions that speaks to these things can potentially engage park users in more of these pro-environmental behaviors. So for example, they have a lot of interpretive opportunities, whether it's experience-based or they have their visitor center, emphasizing the positive attributes of eudaimonic, of long-term pro-environmental behaviors could potentially speak to these eudaimonic values. And then alternatively, hedonic values were quite strong. So it seems that people are prioritizing their pleasure and comfort. And to address this, developing interventions that make pro-environmental behavior engagement easier could potentially foster pro-environmental behavior. Increasing potentially, they have a letter writing stand for individuals to engage with their representatives, just as a out there kind of public engagement, because as we saw, once again, it was more willing to engage in these private sphere behaviors rather than public. So how can Denali foster that? This is something that they can look at these value profiles and develop interventions drawing from our findings. As future research, our research provides a foundation for future studies. Our statistics all performed quite well, and clearly there are merits in exploring these value dimensions further in regards to pro-environmental behavior. Upon further literature review, we found areas where perhaps we could strengthen our wording for scale measurement in particular. The well-being sciences really emphasize the concepts of authenticity and autonomy in eudaimonic values, which was not underscored really in our scale items, and so perhaps in future research this could be integrated. Additionally, with hedonic values, Steg et al. Didn't really underscore this, but once again in the well-being sciences literature, they talked a lot about low negative affect, so decreasing your worries and stress. So potentially the integration of a scale item there could strengthen our capturing of hedonic and eudaimonic values. And then also, because this was only the second study with hedonic values and the first with eudaimonic values, cross-cultural validation will strengthen this research. We had a US-based population that was predominantly white, so testing these in different countries and contexts beyond just national parks, protected areas in the US, but also across different ethnicities, races. We had a pretty good spread of age classes, but further research could definitely benefit or strengthen these dimensions in the context of environmental values. So our research definitely presents merits for expanding the environmental value scale. It fills gaps in understanding self-enhancing behaviors in the context of pro-environmental, in the context of the environment, particularly through bringing in this variable of time. It elaborates on the value-behavior relationship. So if you recall this figure, we have values at the bottom and all these behaviors at the top. So through expanding our value scale to have 5 values rather than 3, potentially we can explain more of these behaviors that we engage in every day, which will help us foster pro-environmental behaviors, but also potentially reduce behaviors that are detrimental to the environment. And ultimately, in the context of Denali National Park and Preserve, through identifying these leverage points for protected area managers, hopefully they can strengthen their educational outreach material, interpretive material, and policies so that they can make national parks a place where they can cultivate and foster this pro-environmental behavior so people can take it home and continue to be stewards of the environment. So thank you so much for watching. I'd like to thank my advisors, both Karina and my German advisor, Heiko Faust, my co-authors, Adam's in the back there, and Rose, several funding grants, and then also my family and friends. Over the last 2 years, I have been all over the world. My family has definitely visited me in several places, and it's been great. And I've also had the pleasure of having 2 groups of students I've worked with, both my master's cohort at the University of Göttingen and then the Van Viper Lab. You can see from these pictures we have a lot of fun, and I've really enjoyed collaborating with you all and working with you all. So thank you so much. Any questions? Yeah.
Were visitors to the park, like, did you ask any questions about whether they came from an urban background or rural background?
We did not. That would have been interesting though. We did ask what states they came from, which you could probably presume more of an urban and rural background, and we have zip codes, but there are likely zip codes that have urban and non-urban areas, so you could maybe deduce some of the information, but probably not all.
I'm wondering, maybe if you explain in a little more detail why you think this location was the like a good location to look at this, because you talked about like pro-environmental behavior, where you talk about like taking public action and political action.
Mm-hmm.
From what I understand, a lot of people in your data set were like tourists and things like
Mm-hmm.
that. So if I'm not like a citizen of Alaska, or you had 26 different countries represented, if I'm not a citizen of the United States,
Mm-hmm.
like that, it could be a barrier, right, to participating in political action or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
Where if you studied in a location that would be more apt to get less tourists, it'd probably be more like people would be more capable of running for political office, writing to legislators,
Mm-hmm.
engaging politically in public forums. So I wonder if that, like, what's the logic? Maybe you could explain that.
Yeah. So those, when explaining the spheres, those are just examples of public versus private sphere. I think the merits of doing this study in a U.S. national park is that these parks draw all sorts of different people, not necessarily people who consider themselves hardcore environmentalists, people that enjoy recreating, and then you also at this park have the cruise ship industry, so it's quite a diversity in individuals and how they engage with the environment. I'd say, and I won't speak for the national park system, but I think they strive to improve stewardship of nature, and through engaging with national parks, you're getting quite a diversity in individuals who come there. It's not like your average person who would necessarily go on a hike on a weekend or something, but these are family vacations that people save up for. Denali is quite a rugged and wild place, so it's not your standard wilderness, next door Kickapoo kind of recreating area. So I'd say that's the strength of it. That being said, you do have tourists, so they're coming from all over the place. That doesn't mean they're going to be invested in Alaska necessarily, but through strengthening interpretive materials or their policies at Denali, potentially people come away with saying, oh, like I really value the places in mine, or at least even I value these national parks. I'm a taxpayer, like my money is going to this. I would like to be more involved, or I see the link between my involvement and how that benefits or hurts other national parks and protected areas in the U.S. or globally. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
I have a follow-up off of that. I think Denali is probably the one park that's farthest away from the majority of like human population versus Great Smokies.
Mm-hmm.
You have it like very close to a huge portion of the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
How do you think that like there might be a difference between groups of people? Like if it's a park that's close by, maybe it's not as much wilderness, but a park that's kind of more in their backyard. How, because very much like the point of doing the survey there was that you had the context of Denali to set off their, like the signals and how they were interpreting what they value in nature and what action. Do you have any thoughts on how it might be different in a different park that's closer to more people?
Yeah, I think, so I definitely think it should be conducted in studies that are not just like Denali where it's so far set. I would say you saw that in our sample population that there was much less diversity in people engaging there. It was quite, they were very well educated and quite well off. So that definitely limits the diversity and what kind of value structures you're sampling from different people. I think that would complement it nicely. I don't think there's a pro, or I don't think one's better than the other. I think due to opportunity, we did it in this location. That being said, to strengthen the environmental value scale. The integration of these two values, it should be tested in a variety of contexts, including not necessarily just protected areas. Like people should be asked on a general basis how they, or what kind of value structures they have, including these, to better understand them.
To add to Sophia's point, the behavioral measures for this study related to intentions. So we asked people what they plan to do in the next 12 months after returning back from the park. So I suppose there's an assumption there that we would be accounting for some of the context-specific dynamics or influences of the park. But we also had a measure of reported behavior related specifically to Denali. So for what it's worth, it was a study of values and intentions.
Yep.
Do you have the opportunity to work with Denali to like implement some of the things that you found from this? Like if people all have to take a bus into the park and they're just sitting there and watching some stuff, maybe giving people those cards to like register or whatever while they're in that location. You know, that might be like a way to implement some of these things. Is there an opportunity to do that, or I would guess that you're providing this to them too?
Yeah, so they will be provided with this and already have been provided with the tech report after the research was conducted. While we were in Alaska, I talked to Rose about it. They're definitely interested in integrating this and strengthening their interpretive materials and strategies, I guess. Her exact wording was the park will use this to inform their strategies or something like that. And so that's the hope. I mean, it is something they're interested in. Rose Keller there is a co-author and also the social scientist at Denali National Park. And this will be passed along to her, and they are hoping to integrate it and improve their outreach programs. It's very much part of the National Park's goals to increase and improve their education outreach programs and foster stewardship of national parks and the environment in the U.S. and beyond. So I hope so. I don't have any direct go-aheads with what they're going to do with it or how they would integrate it, but there was definitely overwhelming enthusiasm about integrating it, and they were looking forward to having the findings.
Yeah, Sophia, very impressive what you just got to presenting to us. I always think it's neat when someone doesn't collect the data at a spot, but they come forward and they make this presentation that's very knowledgeable and detailed about how the data was collected, the way that park is situated. You did a fantastic job, I think, in just a very short time. Was it just 9 months you've been here? To be able to, embrace the project the way that you did was quite impressive.
Thank you.
So kudos to you for just this project that you outlined there. So I've got some questions that deal with what the scale development was. If we could go back a few slides. Did you validate the scale, or it looks like you really used a motive or a value profiles is what you had done. But if you could just walk through I think you said you were validating a scale. If you could talk about how did you validate that there were, let's say, these 5 values? Because I think that's a really neat part of what you've got. You really wanted to expand this scale. So here this is a data set that you came in mid-collection, and it has to do with this, it's very rare, I think, that we get to contribute in such a way that's a juncture. It wasn't just incremental. You actually expanded this scale in a way that was quite striking. I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about what evidence you have that these scales, this hedonic and eudaimonic, were, I guess, validated.
Yeah, sure. So I'll focus on hedonic and eudaimonic because the 3 others have been extensively validated across other contexts as well. Hedonic values, as we said, we drew from Steg et al., who had conducted this study. She did 4 studies in the Netherlands, both students, residents, and varying age groups. To further explore the hedonic and eudaimonic, we did a variety of confirmatory and exploratory factor analyses, looked at cross-loading and factor loading scores as well. And then, as I mentioned, we had done we tested for reliability as well as validity using convergent validity, composite reliability, and then we also did discriminant validity was assessed. I'm sure Karina and or Adam can expand on that. That was done prior to me coming, and then once again as well.
So did you get a factor analysis then that came up with these 5? I mean, it's when I do scales in the past, I've always been, sometimes they fit, sometimes they don't fit. And I guess if you could, so you did a factor analysis first and these items all loaded the way they were supposed to load.
Yeah, so we did exploratory factor analysis.
That's
We did have
impressive.
the loading scores. As I said, we had to drop one item that was
Yeah.
gratification for oneself because it cross-loaded with hedonic values,
Uh-huh.
probably due to the similar language. And then we did a confirmatory factor analysis. And so exploratory was just not reported, but we
I see.
did that and it did load into the 5 dimensions.
So the items behaved as they should
They
behave.
did behave as they
Cool.
should have. Yeah,
That's very neat.
yeah.
Oh.
Well-informed literature review and scale development.
Well, sometimes with different populations, you get a different loading. It doesn't always work that way.
Yeah.
I think of the various scales I've worked with in my life, it's unusual when I get them behaving the way that they should behave. So you've either got a dynamite scale that's really universalistic,
Yeah.
or it's been well tested. And another question then, what you did was it a cluster analysis and then group them into motive or these value profiles? Is that how you came up with these 4 different typologies of people?
Mhm. So that is a latent profile analysis. It's similar to a cluster analysis, but not a cluster analysis.
Okay.
So the concern with cluster analysis is that you can choose the number of clusters, whereas latent profile analysis sorts based on the number of, based on latent variables and multiple variables. And so we then get this 5 model estimate where there's natural breaks in the latent variables. For any set, it would be different. But ultimately then upon assessment, you're supposed to look at these 4 criteria. And upon assessment, we saw that despite the 3 criteria were falling into place, the 4th, which is the bootstrap likelihood ratio, increased significantly, which just demonstrates the model fit of the 5th class. Though it segments naturally, it was not as good of a fit.
I see. And then that was connected to behavior. If you could just, then if you could bring out how that was connected to behavior, you ended up with the 4 different classifications.
So
And so you
then,
got bundles. I think you got bundles of values that people.
yeah, sorry, let me go through here. So then we had these 4 classes. For the 4 classes, based on just value profiles, we then looked at the socio-demographics of these individuals and then also their behavioral engagement. And that's what this one is. So here we have the 5 value dimensions. I'll use my little pointer. On the right side, we have the 5 value dimensions. And then on the left, we have the 3 pro-environmental behaviors. And we took average scores and looked at, on the 1 to 5 Likert scale, how likely people were to engage in these intended behaviors. Does that answer that?
And did that, I mean, so in terms of what, did the behavior, I think, come out the way that you anticipated it to? For instance, you've got these 4 classes, was those 4 classes, is that the way these values generally bundle? And then you've got that nice triangle of sort of going from values to behavior. Did it fall out the way that you thought, or?
So when I started and I didn't know anything, I wanted 5 classes because I was like, oh, cool, we want a class with really strong in each value type.
Yeah.
Upon doing my literature review, I learned that that would not be good or beneficial to the research. So people who have high biospheric values tend to have also high altruistic and vice versa. So it was clear that we would likely get a combination of those 2. Also, we're in the context of a national park, so you can assume that people would be more biospheric than your average population. And then in concern to eudaimonia and hedonia, I was also initially quite disappointed that we didn't get these stark eudaimonic and hedonic groups. But once again, upon reading literature, I learned that it's actually very unhealthy for an individual to have really strong eudaimonia and or hedonia. So if you're only focusing on your short-term needs right now, you're not going to, for example, be very good at financial planning, or you might be really overweight because you're not good at, budgeting your calories. Those are just like broad examples. So ultimately what we found is that people have this relationship between eudaimonia and hedonia, and that's actually much better. It means we have really well-rounded, happy individuals on an overall basis, which is what we'd like for our park users. As you saw, we potentially could have had 5 classes, and that maybe would have helped in some capacity, but we have pretty good sample sizes for each population, so none of them are too small. And also the bootstrap likelihood test changed significantly. So based on that, we chose the 4-class model.
Well, it looks like you've got one that sort of emphasizes eudaimonia, so that's a sort of a, I mean, if you didn't have eudaimonia in there, you may not have found that.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
that's a
So
major
other than
driver.
the eudaimonia, we wouldn't really have found much variation because we really saw The lowest scores on altruistic and biospheric were at about a 7.5 out of a 9-point scale. So there's very low variation in those two value dimensions. And that's not really surprising in a national park so offset as Denali is. But yeah, having this eudaimonic group was something that we were very excited about. It clearly shows that there's a contribution eudaimonia is making. And then hedonia was quite high in all the groups, between like a 5.5 and a 7.5. So that shows it's significantly weighing in on people's value structures. It's not that it was at like 1 or 2. There wasn't as much variation potentially as we could have seen, but further testing might elaborate on that.
Do you think that the fact that you came up with such a high sort of class of people in eudaimonia that helps validate the scale in any way, that it showed it was a player, and that if it was missing, it would be a different mix of profiles?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, across all classes, there was engagement with eudaimonic values. So had that not been there, we definitely would have, I can't say that we would have not been able to capture certain pro-environmental behaviors, but the engagement with, or the high rating of eudaimonic values shows that people are aware that these are things that they value or guiding principles in their life. And I think it would be great to further study how eudaimonic values specifically relate to certain pro-environmental behaviors, which that was beyond the scope of this research, but being the first to test it, there was lots of room for growth and further validating.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
And one thing that I'm still sort of scratching my head about is this relationship between eudaimonia and behavior, and whether eudaimonia is in fact a self-enhancing value. What are your thoughts on that?
Literature's divided. Not so. When we looked at the Stern value scale, if you remember that one, where there are all the different value types, it is put under, or some of the items captured are more under this benevolence area, which in Schwartz's is considered self-transcending value, and in the research that was conducted more recently was considered a self-enhancing value. The addition of this value dimension might say to us that we shouldn't be so strict on our categorization, and potentially there's room to have ones that could potentially speak to self-transcending and self-enhancing needs. But I'm very interested in that. I would love to see further research on that. I know that some people do not feel that it's self-enhancing, but the context of finding bigger meaning in life for yourself and personal development is, in the way it's been defined, inherently self-focused, but it is about using yourself and your own needs to benefit broader meaning. So yeah, jury's out on that one. Yes, Kate, go for it.
So the survey was conducted in 2016, which I think we would all agree was a pretty tumultuous and polarizing year in the United States.
It was right before the election,
right?
So that's helpful, maybe.
I'm wondering, maybe you don't have any specific hypotheses for your research, but maybe just reflecting on how, when those things are going on as you're conducting surveys, how that might affect people's extreme, like that group, the enthusiasts, who basically marked that they were enthusiastic about everything. Everything was an 8 or a 9. How those kinds of like bigger events might affect people putting down extreme values on either end.
I would say for a big part of the country, it probably had an impact, though values are more about these broad concepts, so potentially less impacted than, for example, cultural values, which ask more about how you see a society should be run and where you see your rank within a society. So for our new study, we have removed a cultural value scale that was very politically charged in its wording. In general, it's probably better practice not to use that polarizing language, but in particular in the US especially, there's been quite a polarization of politics in the last couple of years, and so that kind of doesn't tap into people's cultural values, but rather the current political system and regime. I would hope with these value scales that that's not really the case. Based on wording, it really isn't tapping into those things, so achieving your personal best, no matter who's president, that is likely something that's still important to you. Whoever is president, maybe like unity with nature would change more if there's on the off chance a Democrat or Republican who vice versa do or don't value it. That could be something that people would be more likely to consider, but it wouldn't really be hugely influential, I would think, on their core values.
Just so this is looking at the values, not the behavior, right?
This is yes.
Okay. Yeah, because I would imagine a year like 2016 necessarily might not change someone's values, but it could change their behaviors, right? It can make the behaviors come to the surface because values that you long held could start to get questioned, like, oh, I didn't think we had to deal with racism or bigotry anymore. And it's like, oh, well, you still do deal with that. So like now I need to behave in a way to help confront these issues where before you might have thought like, well, these aren't issues anymore. So like it doesn't need to be part of my behavior because no one's really contesting these grounds.
Yeah.
I guess I was thinking, like, if you're looking at kind of where they identify themselves, they might, in a year where it's like there's so much questioning of like, where do you stand? Are you on this end or way over here? People might be more like, well, I really do believe in these things. It's a 9, whereas they might normally, it's not as, relatively important.
Literature suggests that values are stable over time. Post-socialization takes major life events to change value structures, but beliefs are quite dynamic.
And also your behavior. We reflect our values with different behaviors as well, as John was saying. So, yeah, but ultimately, research shows the values wouldn't necessarily shift based on something like that. If the presidential election was something maybe considered a big life event and directly impacted you, perhaps it would, but unlikely, less likely.
Well, it might not be a terrible thing if people were more extreme in their responses on surveys. The worst thing that you can do is sort of agree on a survey and be neutral, because then you don't see the opinion, right? So I think maybe maybe that's a silver lining to this political climate that we're in.
Research for 4 years, so we're saying.
Pronounced values are good.
So my ears perked up a little bit when you started talking about negative affect. Can you go back to that slide? I'm curious how you think. I think it was 28.
Yeah, that was. I have it here. Yeah. Yeah, so this is something that STEG scale really didn't capture, but is your interest, quite prevalent in the well-being sciences. So they talk about both finding in hedonic values discomfort, ease, pleasure, and lightheartedness, but also actively working to reduce stress and worries, which they call low negative affect academically. And so that's something that I have felt that her scale doesn't really capture. I'm not entirely sure why, but it was quite prominent in the well-being sciences. There are 2 researchers in particular, Veronica Huda and Alan Waterman, who are doing extensive research on this hedonic eudaimonic, both the distinction between the 2 dimensions and then also how it affects individuals' happiness. And this is what we've translated to the context of the environment.
Yeah, I was just curious because you can look at negative affect sort of in the short term, like how are you feeling right now, and then in the long term, like how over the past month. And so I think if you look at it in the short term, even just coming into the park, you're going to see like big differences in various day to day. But if you look at sort of the longer term piece of that, if people generally have higher negative affect, maybe they won't come into the park, or maybe if they do, they come to the park to help, relieve some of that. How do you think that might fit into, like, if you generally have higher levels of these sort of negative things like worry and sadness, how do you think that fits into like your values? Like, if you were going to like the eudaimonic and hedonic pieces.
I'm honestly not sure. I know this is your area of expertise, and I totally, great question. I can say that as far as values go, potentially measuring low negative affect and how you would strive for that might be difficult on a value basis, which is maybe why it wasn't included. But I would say there are, in my opinion, people who actively try to make their life as stress-free as possible, and there are people that embrace kind of a chaotic, stressful lifestyle. So potentially developing an item that could capture that both for eudaimonic. In the eudaimonic case, they don't use that language. It's more about self-actualization, which is similar, I guess, on a more long-term and finding meaning and value in life. Self-actualization is usually a positive implication, I would say. I'm not sure how you could reflect that in both of them. And that really wasn't talked about as a core concept of eudaimonic values, but interesting as well.
Yeah, just something
room for you to research. That's not something like the Browning Lab would love to do in their environmental health research.
Well, if there aren't any other questions, let's give Sophia another round of applause.